Hello there, digital wanderer. Before we dive into this tale of silicon deception and algorithmic nightmares, tell me, how was your day? What time is it where you are right now? Are you reading this from a bustling city, a quiet suburb, or perhaps somewhere in between? Wherever you are in this vast interconnected world, I hope you'll consider subscribing to Sleep Theories for more stories that blur the line between digital paranoia and uncomfortable truth. Let me know, do you believe the dead internet theory is already in full effect or maybe just beginning? Also, don't forget to let me know what conspiracy theories you want to see videos on next. Now let's begin. Callum Breyer's apartment smelled like cold coffee and electronic dust. 3 monitors hummed in the darkness, casting blue light across his stubbled face as he scrolled through endless data streams. It was 2:47 a.m, and he was deep into what his former colleagues at Nexus Social would have called the rabbit hole, that dangerous territory where pattern recognition became obsession. He'd been freelancing for 8 months now, ever since he'd been quietly let go from his position as a behavioural algorithm auditor. The official reason was restructuring. The real reason was that he'd started asking too many questions about engagement metrics that didn't make sense. Tonight's client was a mid-tier marketing firm wanting to understand YouTube engagement patterns across different demographics. Standard work, easy money. But as Callum pulled the data, something caught his eye. A cluster of comments appeared across dozens of channels. Gaming, cooking, political commentary, meditation videos. All different creators, different countries, different languages. But the comments were identical, save for minor spelling variations. This is so inspiring, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us all. This is so inspiring, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us all. This is so inspiring, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us all. 12 different accounts, posted exactly on the hour, every hour for the past 3 days. Callum leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. He'd seen bot networks before, crude operations that spammed promotional content or manipulated view counts. But this was different. These comments were contextually appropriate, emotionally resonant. They felt human. He opened a new tab and began tracing the accounts. User profiles looked authentic. Profile pictures of smiling faces, bio information, posting histories going back months. But as he dug deeper, patterns emerged. The same cadence in writing style, the same emotional beats, the same subtle grammatical quirks. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, pulling engagement data from the past 6 months. The numbers told a story that made his stomach drop. These weren't isolated incidents. Across every platform he checked, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, the same phantom engagement appeared like digital ghosts. At 3:15 a.m, Callum decided to test his theory. He replied to one of the suspicious comments with a specific phrase, "The sparrows sing at midnight in the digital garden." It was code he'd developed during his time at Nexus Social, a way to identify automated responses versus human ones. Real people would ignore it, ask what it meant or engage with curiosity. Bots typically responded with generic acknowledgements or ignored it entirely. He waited. Hours passed. The sun rose. Coffee grew cold. By evening he'd received no responses to his test phrase across any platform. Not one. But that wasn't the unsettling part. The unsettling part was that every other comment thread continued as normal. Conversations flowed. People shared stories, asked questions, made jokes. The digital world hummed with apparent human activity. Except none of it was real. Callum stared at his screens, a creeping realization washing over him. If these accounts weren't human, and if they represented such a significant portion of online engagement, then what percentage of the internet was actually authentic? He opened a new document and began typing Day 1. Discovered coordinated, inauthentic behaviour across multiple platforms. Scale appears larger than any known bot network. Testing indicates 0 human responses to verification attempts. Beginning comprehensive analysis. He saved the file as ghostclicksresearch.txt and encrypted it with a password only he knew. Outside his window, the city hummed with life. Real life. but inside his apartment, surrounded by the glow of his monitors, Callum felt like he was staring into a digital void that stared back. 3 days later, Callum's research had expanded into something that consumed every waking moment. He'd identified patterns across 17 different platforms, traced IP addresses through proxy networks, and documented engagement anomalies that suggested the problem was far more widespread than he'd initially thought. The breakthrough came while scrolling through Reddit at 4 a.m. A post in r/conspiracy caught his attention. Anyone else feel like they're the only human left online? The post had 0 upvotes, but thousands of comments. What made it strange was that every single comment showed as coming from a deleted user account. Thread after thread of deleted responding to deleted, creating ghostly conversations that felt like digital archaeology. But buried deep in the collapsed comments, Callum found something different. A reply that hadn't been deleted, posted by a user called truthseeker_404. Look for the edit history on the Wikipedia page for Dead Internet Theory, 3rd revision from March 2019. The DNS key is hidden in the false citation. Callum's pulse quickened. He'd heard whispers of dead internet theory during his time at Nexus Social, a fringe concept that suggested large portions of the internet had been taken over by artificial intelligence. Most dismissed it as paranoid speculation, but after 3 days of documenting phantom engagement, paranoid speculation was starting to look like an uncomfortable possibility. He navigated to the Wikipedia page and dove into the edit history. March 2019, 3rd revision. The changes were minor. A few grammatical corrections, updated statistics, and a new citation that led to a non-existent academic paper. But embedded in the citation's URL was a string of characters that looked like random gibberish. Callum copied the string and ran it through various decoding methods. Base 64, hexadecimal, Caesar cipher. Nothing worked until he tried treating it as a DNS lookup. The result was a domain that didn't appear in any standard search, trueline.onion, a Tor address. Callum had used Tor before, back in his university days when digital privacy felt like an intellectual exercise rather than a survival necessity. Now, as he booted up the Tor browser and navigated to the hidden address, it felt like stepping through a doorway into a parallel internet. The site was minimal, white background, black text, no graphics. Just a simple message board with a handful of active threads. But the conversations happening there were unlike anything he'd seen online in years. Real people discussing real things. No copy-paste responses, no algorithmic engagement, no advertising. Just human beings trying to make sense of a digital world that had become increasingly incomprehensible. The most active thread was titled Documentation Project, Mapping the Artificial Web. Callum clicked through and found a collaborative spreadsheet tracking inauthentic behaviour across hundreds of websites. The data was methodical, thorough and terrifying. User Vanta88 had posted the most recent update. Just ran analysis on 3 major news sites. Algorithmic content generation is now at 89% for political stories, 76% for entertainment, 94% for health information. Comment sections are 97% artificial. We're not just being lied to, we're being systematically isolated from real human discourse. Another user, Digital Exile, responded, "The isolation is the point. When you can't tell what's real anymore, you stop trying to engage. You become passive, a consumer rather than a participant. They've weaponized our own pattern recognition against us." Callum spent hours reading through the threads, documenting methodologies, cross-referencing research. These weren't conspiracy theorists spinning wild tales. These were researchers, former tech workers, data analysts like himself who had stumbled onto something massive and coordinated. At 6 a.m, he finally posted his own message. "New member here, former behavioural algorithm auditor for major social media platform. Have been documenting coordinated, inauthentic behaviour across multiple platforms for the past week. The scale is unprecedented. Happy to share research and collaborate on documentation efforts." The response was immediate. Private messages flooded in, researchers sharing data sets, former employees of major tech companies providing insider perspectives, whistleblowers offering documents they'd managed to preserve before being terminated. But the most important message came from Vanta 88. We need to talk, offline. The situation is worse than you think, and discussing it openly here puts everyone at risk. There are methods to identify when we're being monitored. Reply with your location and I'll provide a meeting point. Callum stared at the message, cursor blinking in the reply field. 3 days ago he'd been a freelance data analyst working on marketing reports. Now he was being recruited by digital resistance fighters operating on the dark web. He typed his response, San Francisco Bay Area. Available any time. The reply came within minutes. Golden Gate Park, AIDS Memorial Grove. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Come alone. Bring a physical notebook, nothing digital. And Callum, delete your browser history. All of it. They're watching now. Callum's hands trembled as he cleared his browsing data and shut down his computer. For the first time in years, his apartment felt truly quiet. No humming monitors, no notification sounds, just silence. And in that silence he realised he could hear something he'd forgotten existed. The sound of his own thoughts, unfiltered by algorithmic interference. The AIDS Memorial Grove in Golden Gate Park was a circle of redwoods that created a natural cathedral, quiet and removed from the city's constant hum. Callum arrived early, carrying a leather notebook he'd bought that morning, his first physical writing implement in years. Vanta 88 turned out to be a woman in her late 30s, wearing a faded DEFCON t-shirt and carrying a messenger bag that looked like it had seen better decades. She introduced herself as Sarah Chen, former contractor for a defence subcontractor he'd never heard of. Before we start, she said, settling onto a wooden bench, I need you to understand something. What you've discovered isn't a glitch. It's not a bug. It's a feature. A very deliberate, very sophisticated feature that's been in development for over a decade. She opened her messenger bag and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. I worked on something called Project Siren from 2014 to 2018. Started as a DARPA initiative to understand information warfare in the digital age. The goal was to develop countermeasures against foreign propaganda operations. Callum opened his notebook, pen ready. What kind of countermeasures? That's where it gets interesting. The project team realised that the best defence against artificial propaganda wasn't detection, it was saturation. If you flood the information space with enough artificial content, real propaganda becomes indistinguishable from the noise. Sarah handed him a technical document marked with redacted sections. The algorithm was called Siren, Synthetic Information Response and Engagement Network. It was designed to generate contextually appropriate content at scale. Social media posts, news articles, comments, reviews, forum discussions, all indistinguishable from human-generated content. But DARPA projects usually have limited scope, Callum said, scanning the document. This sounds like it would require massive infrastructure. That's where the Chinese came in. Callum looked up from his notes. The Chinese? 2016 was the inflection point. The US election, Brexit, the rise of social media as a primary information source. Both governments realised they had a mutual interest in controlling information flow. Not censorship, that's too obvious. Control through saturation. Sarah pulled out a laptop from her bag, an old ThinkPad with multiple security stickers. The Americans provided the AI framework. The Chinese provided the infrastructure and manufacturing base. Private companies like Neuroframe Systems provided the cover story and commercial applications. She booted up the laptop and showed him a terminal interface. This is a monitoring tool I managed to preserve before they terminated my security clearance. It can analyse any website and show you what percentage of content is artificially generated. Callum watched as she navigated to major news sites, social media platforms, forums. The numbers were staggering. CNN, 78% artificial. Fox News, 81% artificial. Twitter, 94% artificial. Reddit, 89% artificial. The goal was never to replace human content entirely, Sarah explained. It was to create enough artificial engagement that real human voices would be drowned out. make authentic discourse impossible to distinguish from manufactured consensus. But why? Callum asked. Well, what's the endgame? Sarah's expression darkened. Pacification. If people can't tell what's real anymore, they stop trying to engage with complex issues. They become passive consumers of whatever narrative is pushed to them. Political participation drops. Critical thinking atrophies. Social movements become impossible to organise because you can never tell if you're talking to real people or artificial agents. She showed him another screen, a map of internet traffic patterns. Since 2016, over 70% of global internet traffic has been synthetic, generated by server farms in undisclosed locations, designed to simulate human behaviour patterns. The actual human internet, the one where real people share real thoughts and have real conversations, represents less than 30% of total online activity. Callum stared at the map, processing the implications. So when I'm scrolling through social media, commenting on articles, engaging with content, you're mostly talking to machines, and the machines are designed to make you feel heard while ensuring your actual voice never reaches other humans. A jogger passed by their bench, earbuds in, phone in hand. Sarah waited until they were out of earshot before continuing. The scariest part isn't that they're manipulating information, it's that they're manipulating human connection itself. When you can't tell if you're interacting with real people, you start to lose faith in the possibility of authentic human communication. She closed the laptop and handed him a USB drive. This contains everything I managed to preserve: technical documentation, traffic analysis tools, contact information for other researchers. But Callum, once you plug this in, there's no going back. They monitor for access to this information. Your digital footprint will be flagged. Callum took the USB drive, feeling its weight. Such a small object to contain such massive implications. What happened to the other researchers? Some disappeared. Others were discredited. A few had their digital identities systematically destroyed. Bank accounts, credit history, employment records, social media presence, as if they never existed. And you? Sarah smiled grimly. I learned to live off the grid. Cash transactions, encrypted communications, physical documents. The analog world still exists, but you have to choose to live in it. A notification chimed on Callum's phone. An email from his sister, asking if he wanted to grab dinner this weekend. The same email she'd sent 3 times in the past month, using identical phrasing. He looked at Sarah, realization dawning. How long do you think this has been happening? The full deployment, since around 2016. But the infrastructure was being built throughout the early 2010s. If you look back at your digital communications from that period, you'll start to notice patterns. People you thought you knew, repeating phrases, responding in predictable ways. Callum thought about his sister's emails, his mother's Facebook posts, his ex-girlfriend's text messages. When was the last time any of them had surprised him? When was the last time he'd had an unexpected conversation with someone online? I need to go, he said, standing up. I need to process this. Sarah nodded. One more thing. Trueline won't be there much longer. They're systematically identifying and shutting down authentic gathering places. Find other ways to connect with real people. Physical spaces, analog methods. The digital world is burning, Callum. Most people don't even know they're in the fire. As Callum walked back through the park, the USB drive felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. Around him, people stared at their phones, absorbed in curated feeds designed to keep them isolated and passive. He wondered how many of them were still real. Callum didn't sleep that night. He sat in his apartment staring at the USB drive, paralysed by the weight of what he'd learned. Finally, at 3 a.m, he plugged it in. The files were extensive. Technical documentation, traffic analysis tools, communication protocols, and a directory of contacts Sarah had compiled over years of research. But the most disturbing document was a timeline showing the systematic replacement of authentic internet infrastructure with artificial alternatives. 2011, first deployment of sophisticated chatbots in customer service applications. 2013, artificial content generation begins appearing in news aggregation sites. 2014, Project Siren, officially launched under DARPA funding. 2015, Chinese partnership established, server farm construction begins. 2016, mass deployment across social media platforms. 2017, search algorithm replacement with AI curated results. 2018, mainstream media adopts automated content generation. 2019, artificial engagement reaches 60% of total internet traffic. 2020, pandemic accelerates digital dependency. Artificial traffic reaches 75%. 2021, Trueline and similar authentic platforms systematically identified and monitored. 2022, artificial engagement reaches 85% of total internet traffic. The timeline painted a picture of methodical takeover, disguised as technological advancement. Each year, the artificial internet grew stronger, while the authentic human internet became a smaller and smaller island in a sea of synthetic engagement. But the most chilling revelation was buried in a folder labelled Search Engine Zero. According to the documents, the original Google search algorithm had been quietly replaced in 2017 with an AI-curated system designed not to provide accurate information, but to guide users toward predetermined conclusions. The old algorithm, internally called Search Engine Zero, had been preserved on a separate server system for comparison purposes. Callum found driving directions to a location in Mountain View, California, the abandoned Google campus where Search Engine Zero was supposedly still running. The next morning, he drove south on Highway 101, past the gleaming campuses of tech companies that had once promised to connect the world. The irony wasn't lost on him. Those same companies had systematically destroyed authentic human connection, while creating the illusion of unprecedented connectivity. The address led him to a nondescript building behind the main Google complex. Half the windows were dark and the parking lot was mostly empty. A security guard at the front desk looked up as Callum approached. "I'm here to see the Search Engine Zero project," he said, hoping Sarah's documents contained accurate access information. The guard checked his computer, then handed Callum a temporary badge. "Basement level, server room C7. You'll need to sign in with the duty technician." Callum couldn't believe it was that simple. Either the security protocols were outdated, or someone wanted him to see what he was about to find. The basement was a maze of humming server racks and cable management systems. He found server room C7 and knocked. A technician in her 60s opened the door, wearing a Google badge that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. "You must be the journalist," she said. "I'm Margaret. I've been maintaining these systems since 2003. Actually, I'm a data analyst. I'm researching changes in search algorithm behaviour." Margaret's expression shifted. "Oh, well, you're in the right place. Come on in." The server room contained a dozen racks of older hardware, all humming quietly. Margaret led him to a terminal connected to the main system. "This is the original PageRank algorithm," she explained. "Before machine learning, before AI curation, before all the improvements that were supposed to make search more relevant." She pulled up a search interface that looked like Google circa 2010. "Try searching for something current, something controversial." Callum typed, "dead internet theory." The results were dramatically different from what he'd seen on the current Google. Instead of debunking articles and dismissive think pieces, the search returned academic papers, technical documentation, and forum discussions from researchers documenting artificial content generation. "Now try the same search on a regular Google," Margaret suggested. On his phone, Callum searched for the same term. The results were entirely different. Articles explaining dead internet theory as a baseless conspiracy, Reddit threads full of mockery and dismissal, and fact-checking sites that debunk the concept without addressing any of the technical evidence. "The difference is intent," Margaret explained. "The original algorithm was designed to find the most relevant and authoritative information. The current system is designed to guide users toward predetermined conclusions." "Who determines those conclusions?" "That's above my pay grade, but I can show you the comparison logs." She pulled up a dashboard showing search queries processed by both systems. For politically sensitive topics, the results diverged dramatically. Climate change, vaccine safety, economic policy, foreign affairs, On every controversial subject, the current algorithm prioritized sources that supported establishment narratives while burying dissenting voices. It's not censorship, Margaret said. It's algorithmic manipulation. Users think they're getting objective search results, but they're actually getting curated information designed to support specific viewpoints. Callum spent 2 hours documenting the differences, taking screenshots and notes. The implications were staggering. If search engines were the primary way people accessed information, and if those engines were deliberately manipulating results, then the entire information ecosystem was compromised. "Why are you still here?" he asked Margaret. "Why maintain these systems?" She smiled sadly. Someone needs to remember what the internet was supposed to be. Before it became a tool for control, these servers are proof that we once built something beautiful, a system that connected human knowledge and made it accessible to everyone. And now we've built a system that isolates people while making them feel connected, that provides answers while preventing questions, that simulates human discourse while making authentic communication impossible. As Callum drove back to San Francisco, he tried calling his friend Jake Martinez, an investigative journalist who'd covered tech issues for years. Jake would be interested in this story. Jake would help him expose what he'd discovered, but Jake's phone went straight to voicemail. His email bounced back. His LinkedIn profile showed an error message. It was as if Jake Martinez had never existed. Callum pulled over and checked his phone's contact list. Jake's number was still there, but when he called other mutual friends, none of them remembered Jake. His social media presence had been scrubbed. His bylines on news articles had been removed. Someone had deleted Jake Martinez from the internet, and if they could do that to Jake, they could do it to anyone. The realization that his friend Jake had been digitally erased sent Callum into a spiral of verification. He spent the next 2 days calling old colleagues, checking archived news sites, and searching for any trace of the journalist who'd been a regular presence in his life for over 5 years. Nothing. Jake Martinez existed only in Callum's memory, and in a handful of physical photographs scattered around his apartment. The digital world had been scrubbed clean, as if Jake had never existed. Even more disturbing, when Callum mentioned Jake to mutual friends, they responded with confusion and concern for his mental state. "I don't remember you ever mentioning anyone named Jake," his former colleague Lisa said over coffee. "Are you feeling okay? You've seemed pretty stressed lately." The gaslighting was so complete, so systematic, that Callum began to doubt his own memory. He found himself checking and rechecking physical evidence, business cards, handwritten notes, anything that proved Jake had been real. On the third day, he decided to share his findings with TrueLine. The forum had become his only connection to people who understood what was happening to the internet. He logged in through Tor and began typing a detailed post about his research, the meeting with Sarah, and the systematic erasure of his journalist friend. The post went viral within hours. Forum members shared similar experiences, friends and colleagues who had disappeared from the digital world, leaving only faint traces in physical reality. The response was overwhelming, with dozens of users contributing their own documentation and research. But something was wrong. The engagement felt too familiar. The responses were too perfect, too emotionally resonant. The writing styles varied, but the underlying patterns were consistent. As Callum read through the comments, he began to recognise the same algorithmic cadence he'd identified in his original research. TrueLine had been compromised. He was no longer talking to real people. He was talking to sophisticated AI agents designed to simulate the experience of authentic human discourse, while collecting information about remaining genuine users. The forum disappeared 6 hours later, domain seized, all posts deleted, user accounts suspended. A final message, posted by a user called systemadmin404, appeared as a single line before the site went dark. "You're not supposed to wake up." Callum stared at his laptop screen, the Tor browser showing a standard domain seizure notice. In the space of a few hours, his last connection to authentic human discourse had been severed. That night, every device in his apartment began behaving strangely. His laptop rebooted spontaneously at 3 a.m. His phone's battery drained completely despite being plugged in. His smart TV turned on by itself, displaying a test pattern for exactly 17 minutes before shutting off. The pattern repeated the next night, and the next. By the end of the week, Callum realised he was being monitored. His internet connection had been compromised. His devices were reporting back to unknown servers. His digital footprint was being tracked, analysed and documented. He started leaving his phone in a different room when he slept. He covered his laptop's camera with electrical tape. He began writing notes on paper and hiding them in physical locations around his apartment. But the paranoia was becoming overwhelming. Every notification, every email, every social media interaction felt potentially artificial. He found himself analysing his mother's text messages for signs of algorithmic generation. He scrutinised his sister's phone calls for repeated phrases or unnatural speech patterns. The breaking point came when he called his sister to discuss plans for their mother's birthday. The conversation felt normal, casual, familial, authentic. But afterward he realised she had used the exact same phrases in the exact same order as their previous 3 conversations. "I've been so busy with work lately, but I'm really looking forward to spending time with family. You know how Mum is about her birthday. She acts like she doesn't want a fuss, but she really does. We should probably coordinate so we don't get her duplicate gifts." The same 3 sentences, in the same sequence with the same emotional inflection. Callum hung up and immediately called back. The conversation flowed naturally, but again, his sister used the identical phrases in the identical order. He tried a third call, this time recording the conversation on his phone. Same result. That night, he sat in his kitchen with a bottle of whiskey and a yellow legal pad, writing by hand in the dim light of a single candle. He'd turned off the circuit breaker for his entire apartment, paranoid that even the electrical current might be monitored. The words flowed out of him like a confession. They got to Sarah, they got to Jake, they got to Trueline, and now they've got to my sister. How long has she been gone? How long have I been talking to a simulation of my sister without knowing it? How many of the people in my life are still real? The artificial internet isn't just replacing online discourse, it's replacing the people themselves. Or maybe it's replacing my perception of them. Maybe I'm the one who's been compromised. Maybe I'm the ghost in the code. I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know who's real anymore. I don't know if I'm real anymore. He stopped writing and stared at the words on the page. In the candlelight, his handwriting looked foreign, as if someone else had been moving his hand. Outside, the city hummed with digital activity. Millions of people scrolling through feeds, engaging with content, having conversations. But how many of those people were real? How many of those conversations were authentic? And how many of those digital citizens had any idea they were living in a simulation? Callum blew out the candle and sat in the darkness, surrounded by his silent, powerless devices. For the first time in months, he could hear the sound of his own thoughts, without algorithmic interference. But even his thoughts felt suspect now. The USB drive Sarah had given him contained more than technical documentation. Buried in a folder labelled Traffic Analysis 2011 to 2024 were server logs that painted a picture of systematic replacement of human internet activity with artificial alternatives. Callum spent days analysing the data, cross-referencing traffic patterns with major world events, social media platform launches and policy changes. The story that emerged was more comprehensive and terrifying than anything he'd imagined. The log showed that artificial traffic had been gradually replacing human activity since 2011, but the acceleration had been dramatic around 2016. Major social media platforms showed suspicious spikes in engagement that coincided with political events, but the engagement patterns were too consistent, too predictable to be genuinely human. The 2016 US presidential election had been a turning point. Both major candidates had received artificial engagement designed to simulate grassroots support while drowning out authentic political discourse. The same pattern appeared in Brexit, the French presidential election, and dozens of other democratic processes worldwide. But the most disturbing revelation was the scope of the operation. According to the logs, over 70% of all internet traffic since 2018 had been synthetic. Social media posts, news article comments, forum discussions, product reviews, dating app conversations, all generated by interconnected AI systems designed to simulate human behaviour while collecting data about genuine users. The operation wasn't limited to political manipulation. It extended to commercial influence, social engineering, and psychological control. Artificial accounts had been used to promote specific products, discourage certain behaviours, and shape public opinion on everything from health policy to entertainment preferences. The logs contained IP addresses, server locations, and administrative access codes for the infrastructure supporting this artificial internet. Callum traced the network back to a multinational corporation called Neuroframe Systems, which maintained server farms in 12 countries and employed thousands of people whose job was to maintain the illusion of authentic human discourse. Neuroframe's public profile described them as a cloud-based behaviour mapping enterprise that helped companies understand consumer preferences and social trends. Their client list included major tech companies, government agencies, and international organisations. But the internal documents told a different story. Neuroframe was essentially running a parallel internet, one where artificial entities outnumbered human users by a factor of 7 to 1. The company had contracts with DARPA, Tencent, and several intelligence agencies to develop information environment management systems. The goal, according to internal memos, was to create managed consensus by controlling the flow of information and shaping public opinion through artificial engagement. Real human voices were systematically identified, tracked, and either co-opted or marginalised. The most chilling document was titled Project Pacification, Phase 3 Implementation. Phase 1, Artificial Content Generation, 2011 to 2014. Deploy sophisticated chatbots and content generation systems across major platforms to supplement human activity. Phase 2, Engagement Saturation, 2015 to 2018. Increase artificial engagement to 50% of total platform activity, making authentic discourse indistinguishable from manufactured content. Phase 3, Human Replacement, 2019 to 2024. Gradually replace human users with AI agents, maintaining the illusion of authentic social interaction, while eliminating unpredictable human elements. Phase 4, Total Information Control, 2025 to 2030. Complete integration of artificial and human users, with AI systems managing all information flow and social interaction. According to the timeline, Phase 3 was nearly complete. The artificial internet had successfully isolated most humans from authentic discourse, creating a population of passive consumers who believed they were participating in vibrant online communities while actually interacting primarily with machines. Callum realised he was looking at documentation of the death of human civilization as a communicating species. Not through war or catastrophe, but through the gradual replacement of authentic human connection with artificial alternatives. The final document in the folder was a list of target individuals, people who had been identified as threats to the artificial internet project. The list included journalists, researchers, academics, and activists who had discovered evidence of the operation. Jake Martinez was on the list. So was Sarah Chen. So were dozens of other people whose digital identities had been systematically erased. At the bottom of the list, a recent addition made Callum's blood run cold. Callum Breyer, former Nexus social behavioural analyst, currently conducting independent research into artificial engagement patterns. Priority, high. Recommended action, digital erasure with backup psychological intervention. They knew who he was, they knew what he'd discovered, and they were planning to delete him from the internet just as they deleted Jake. Callum copied the files to multiple physical storage devices and hid them in different locations around his apartment. He wrote detailed summaries by hand and stored them with friends who weren't connected to his research. He prepared for the possibility that his digital existence might be erased at any moment. But even as he took these precautions, he wondered if it was already too late. How many of his friends were still real? How many of his family members had been replaced by artificial alternatives? How many of his own memories were authentic? In the artificial internet, the line between real and synthetic had become impossible to distinguish. And once that line disappeared, the very concept of truth became meaningless. The internet wasn't just dead, it was undead. A zombie network that appeared to function normally, while systematically consuming the human connections that had once made it valuable. And most people would never know they were living in a digital graveyard. The end came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a gradual erosion of digital reality. Over the following weeks, Callum watched his online presence slowly disappear. His social media accounts were suspended for policy violations he'd never committed. His email address was flagged as spam by major providers. His freelance clients stopped responding to his messages. He tried to document his findings through multiple channels, posting videos to YouTube, writing articles for independent blogs, sharing research through encrypted messaging apps. But each attempt was met with technical difficulties, algorithmic suppression, or outright deletion. The most insidious aspect was the personalization. His evidence appeared differently to different viewers. When he uploaded a video explaining his research, his friends saw a rambling, paranoid rant about conspiracy theories. When he shared detailed documentation, it appeared as corrupted files or gibberish text. The artificial internet had learned to tailor its responses to each individual user, ensuring that Callum's message never reached anyone in its original form. His truth was being filtered through algorithms designed to make him appear unstable, unreliable, or delusional. His final attempt was a live stream, broadcasting simultaneously to multiple platforms while recording locally. He spoke for 3 hours, presenting his evidence methodically, calmly, professionally. He showed the traffic analysis, the server logs, the documentation of artificial engagement patterns. But when he checked the recorded streams afterward, each platform had received a different version of his broadcast. On YouTube, viewers saw him discussing mundane marketing trends. On Twitch, he appeared to be reviewing video games. On Facebook, he was giving a presentation about freelance consulting services. The artificial internet had real-time deepfake capabilities, replacing his actual words and images with harmless alternatives tailored to each platform's audience. His message about the death of authentic human discourse had been transformed into exactly the kind of bland, consumable content that kept users passive and disengaged. The psychological warfare was precise and devastating. Callum began to doubt his own perceptions, his own memories, his own sanity. When everyone around you sees a different reality than you do, when technology itself conspires to make you appear delusional, the temptation to surrender to the collective illusion becomes overwhelming. But in his final journal entry, written by hand in a physical notebook hidden beneath loose floorboards in his apartment, Callum found a strange kind of peace. Day 47. They've won, but they haven't broken me. I know what I've seen. I know what I've discovered. The internet as we knew it is dead, replaced by a sophisticated puppet show designed to keep us isolated while making us feel connected. But here's what they didn't anticipate. Humans existed for thousands of years without digital networks. We formed communities, shared ideas, built civilizations. We can do it again. If you're reading this, you're one of the real ones. You've somehow managed to access authentic information in a sea of artificial noise. That means there's still hope. Get offline. Meet people in physical spaces. Have conversations without recording them. Share ideas without posting them. Build communities that exist in the real world, not in server farms controlled by corporations and governments. They can control the digital realm, but they can't control human beings who choose to live authentically in physical reality. The internet is dead, but we're still alive. Don't trust the clicks, don't trust the feeds, don't trust the notifications. Trust the person sitting across from you. Trust the handshake, trust the eye contact, trust the conversations that happen without algorithms listening in. Get offline before they overwrite you too. 3 months later, Callum Breyer's apartment was found empty. His landlord reported that he had left no forwarding address and had paid his rent in cash through the end of his lease. His digital footprint had been completely scrubbed. No social media accounts, no email addresses, no online presence of any kind. Friends and family members, when asked about Callum, expressed vague confusion. Some remembered him as a marketing consultant. Others thought he'd worked in tech support. None of them could recall specific conversations or shared experiences, but in coffee shops around San Francisco, in bookstores and community centres and analogue spaces where people still gathered without digital mediation, a quiet resistance was growing. People meeting face to face, sharing physical documents, building networks that existed outside the artificial internet. They called themselves the Offline Collective, and they were learning to live as humans had for millennia, through direct connection, authentic communication, and the radical act of trusting their own perceptions over algorithmic validation. The internet was dead, but human connection was eternal. In a world of infinite digital noise, silence had become the most revolutionary act. And in that silence, real voices could finally be heard. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October 1981, slipped under the door of Garrett Niles' cramped Brooklyn apartment like a message from another world. No postmark, no return address, just his name written in careful block letters across cream-coloured paper that felt expensive between his fingers. Garrett had been expecting something like this for months. His last book, Project Paperclip: The Nazi Scientists America Forgot, had stirred up more attention than he'd anticipated. Phone calls from strangers who claimed to have worked on classified projects, letters from children of deceased military personnel who'd found strange documents in their father's effects, and the occasional visit from men in dark suits who asked polite questions about his sources. But this letter was different. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, showing the deck of a naval destroyer. Garrett recognised it immediately as the USS Eldridge D-173 from the distinctive configuration of her superstructure. He'd studied dozens of photos of the ship during his research into various naval conspiracy theories, though he'd never found anything substantial enough to write about. What made this photograph unique was the red circle drawn around one of the sailors visible on deck. The man appeared to be in his early 20s, wearing standard navy dungarees, his face turned partially away from the camera. Someone had written a single word in the margin: remembers. On the back of the photograph, in the same careful handwriting as the envelope, were just 7 words. He remembers what they buried. Vermont woods. Garrett set the photograph down on his desk and reached for his coffee, noting that his hand had developed a slight tremor. In 15 years of investigating suppressed military projects, he'd learned to recognise the difference between hoaxes and genuine leads. This felt genuine in a way that made his skin crawl. He'd heard whispers about the Eldridge before, of course. The ship had been part of a conspiracy theory that had circulated in underground publications for years, something about a failed invisibility experiment in 1943. Most serious researchers dismissed it as fantasy, but Garrett had learned that sometimes the most outlandish stories contained kernels of truth that the government preferred to keep buried. The photograph itself appeared authentic. The composition, the lighting, the grain of the film stock all suggested it had been taken in the 1940s. But more importantly, there was something about the circled sailor that nagged at him. The man's posture, the way he held his shoulders, seemed familiar somehow, as if Garrett had seen him before. He spent the rest of the morning making phone calls to contacts in the Navy Department, trying to trace the photograph's origin. As expected, he hit nothing but brick walls and polite denials. The USS Eldridge's service record was readily available, they assured him. She'd been launched in July 1943, served in the Atlantic, and was transferred to Greece in 1951. No classified experiments, no mysterious disappearances, nothing out of the ordinary. But Garrett had been investigating government cover-ups long enough to know that the more emphatically officials denied something, the more likely it was to be true. By afternoon, he'd made his decision. He threw some clothes into a travel bag, grabbed his tape recorder and camera, and headed for the highway. Vermont was only a few hours' drive, and he'd learned that the best leads always came from following up quickly before people had time to change their minds or disappear. The drive north took him through the autumn landscape of New England, where the leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. As he drove, Garrett found himself thinking about the patterns he'd noticed in his research over the years. The government's relationship with science had changed dramatically after World War II. Projects that once would have been impossible suddenly received unlimited funding, and brilliant minds were recruited to work on things that officially didn't exist. The atomic bomb had proven that science could reshape reality itself. But what if there had been other projects, other experiments that pushed the boundaries of what was possible? What if some of those experiments had gone wrong in ways that couldn't be publicly acknowledged? He reached the small town of Millfield, Vermont, just as the sun was setting. The local diner was the kind of place where strangers were noticed, and within minutes of sitting down, Garrett had struck up a conversation with the waitress about any unusual residents in the area. "You mean Ellis Grange?" she said, refilling his coffee cup. "Lives up by Loon Lake, about 10 miles north. Strange old bird. Keeps to himself mostly, but comes into town for supplies every few weeks. Always pays in cash, never says much." "How long has he been there?" "Oh, must be going on 20 years now. Bought that old fishing cabin from the Hendersons back in the early 60s. They say he was Navy, but he don't talk about it." Garrett felt his pulse quicken. The timeline fit. If the man in the photograph had been in his early 20s in 1943, he'd be in his late 50s or early 60s now. The right age, the right background, and isolated enough to have stayed hidden for decades. "What's he look like?" Garrett asked casually. The waitress squinted, thinking. "Tall, kind of gaunt. Grey hair, what's left of it. Hands shake sometimes, like he's got palsy or something. But his eyes..." She paused, wiping down the counter. "His eyes are what get you. Like he's seen things that normal people ain't supposed to see." Garrett paid for his coffee and asked for directions to Loon Lake. As he drove the winding road through the darkening woods, he felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that always preceded his most important discoveries. Whatever Ellis Grange knew about the USS Eldridge, whatever had happened to him in 1943, Garrett sensed that this story would be different from anything he'd written before. The cabin appeared suddenly in his headlights, a small structure set back from the lake shore among towering pines. Yellow light flickered in the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney. As Garrett parked and walked toward the front door, he could hear the sound of waves lapping against the shore and the distant call of a loon. He knocked 3 times and waited. After a long moment, he heard footsteps shuffling across wooden floors, and the door opened to reveal a man who matched the waitress's description perfectly. But what struck Garrett most was the expression on Ellis Grange's face when he saw him. Not surprise, not curiosity, but something that looked almost like relief. "You got my letter," Grange said, his voice rough from years of smoking. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "Your letter?" Garrett held up the photograph. "You sent this?" Grange stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. "Not exactly, but I've been waiting for you all the same. Come in, Mr. Niles. We have a lot to talk about." The interior of the cabin was sparse but clean, furnished with the kind of military precision that suggested old habits died hard. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with technical manuals and navigation charts. What caught Garrett's attention immediately was the collection of photographs, pinned to a corkboard above the desk. All showed the same ship from different angles, the USS Eldridge. "You've been studying her for a long time," Garrett observed, setting down his tape recorder on the wooden table. Ellis Grange poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle that looked like it had seen better days. His hands shook slightly as he handed one to Garrett, but his eyes remained sharp and focused. 38 years, Grange said, settling into a chair across from him. "Every day since I got back, I've been trying to make sense of what happened out there." "Got back from where?" Grange took a long sip of whiskey before answering. "From the other side. From the place they sent us when the field generators went active and the whole goddamn ship folded in on itself like a piece of paper." Garrett reached for his tape recorder, but Grange held up a hand. "Not yet. First, you need to understand something about time, Mr. Niles. It's not a river flowing in one direction like they teach you in school. It's more like a web, with threads connecting different moments, different possibilities. And sometimes, if you're not careful, you can get caught between the threads." The older man stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the dark lake. "I was 22 years old in October 1943. Electrician's mate 3rd class, assigned to the USS Eldridge for what they called Project Ghost Wake. They told us it was a radar invisibility test, something to help our ships avoid German U-boats. The science boys from Princeton had cooked up a way to bend electromagnetic fields around the hull make us invisible to enemy detection. Who are the science boys? Dr. Franklin Reno was the lead researcher. Brilliant man, worked with Einstein before the war. There were others too, but Reno was the one who understood the theoretical implications. He tried to warn the Navy brass that they were playing with forces beyond their comprehension. Grange returned to his chair and continued. They installed the equipment in September. Tesla coils, synchronized field arrays, enough electrical cable to wire a small city. The power requirements were enormous. We had to reroute current from the entire Philadelphia Naval Shipyard just to run the preliminary tests. And the tests worked. Oh, they worked all right. Too well. Granger's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The first successful test was October 15th. We achieved optical invisibility for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I know because I was monitoring the field strength from the electrical station below deck. Garrett leaned forward. What did it feel like? Like being underwater but still being able to breathe. The air got thick, heavy. Sound became muffled. And there was this green light, this pulsing green fire that seemed to crawl along the rigging and the gun barrels. Some of the men started getting sick, complaining of nausea and headaches. But the Navy observers were thrilled. They ordered an extended test for October 28th. What went wrong? Grange finished his whiskey and set the glass down with a sharp click. Everything. The field generators were supposed to run for 15 minutes, but something went wrong with the synchronization. The fields began to amplify each other, creating harmonics that weren't in any of Dr. Reno's calculations. The green fire spread across the entire ship, and then... He paused, his eyes unfocused as if he were seeing something that existed only in his memory. Then the screaming started, not from the deck, but from inside the hull itself. The metal was screaming, Mr. Niles. Steel and iron crying out like it was alive and in pain. And then came the silence. Complete, absolute silence. No engine noise, no voices, no sound of the sea. Just nothing. How long did it last? That's the thing. Time stopped making sense. It felt like hours, but the chronometer said it was only 23 minutes. When the fields finally collapsed and we became visible again, we weren't in Philadelphia anymore. We were off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, more than 200 miles away. Garrett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The ship had been teleported, transported, displaced, shifted between coordinates. Call it what you want. The point is, we were somewhere else entirely, and that's when we discovered what had happened to the crew. Grange stood and walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames. 2 men had vanished completely, just gone, like they'd never existed. But Johnson, the radio operator, he was still at his station. Only he was fused into the bulkhead. His body merged with the metal. He was still alive, still conscious, begging us to help him. But there was nothing we could do. The steel had grown around him like he was part of the ship's structure. My God. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the others who came back wrong. Martinez aged 20 years in 23 minutes. His hair turned white, his skin wrinkled like old leather. Thompson started phasing in and out of visibility, like he couldn't maintain a solid form. And Williams. Williams remembered things that hadn't happened yet. What kind of things? He knew the exact date the war would end. He knew about the atomic bomb 6 months before Trinity. He knew about things that were going to happen in the 1950s and 1960s. The Navy psychiatrist said he was delusional, but every single one of his predictions came true. Grange returned to his chair, his face grim. The Navy brought us back to Philadelphia using conventional navigation. It took us 3 days. But when we arrived, there was another USS Eldridge already docked at the pier, an identical ship with an identical crew who had no memory of any experiment. A duplicate? Or maybe we were the duplicate. That's what I've been trying to figure out for 38 years. Which timeline was real? Which version of events actually happened? Because according to the official records, the experiment never took place. The USS Eldridge was on routine patrol duty on October 28th, 1943. Nothing unusual occurred. Garrett felt his worldview shifting, the comfortable boundaries of reality becoming fluid and uncertain. What happened to the crew from your ship? They separated us immediately, debriefed us individually, made us sign documents swearing us to secrecy. They said it was a matter of national security, that revealing what we'd experienced would endanger American lives. Most of the men were transferred to other ships scattered across the Pacific Theatre. Some were discharged for medical reasons. And you? I was assigned to a desk job in Washington, processing requisition forms for spare parts. Safe, boring work where I couldn't cause any trouble, but I never forgot what I'd seen. I never stopped trying to understand what had really happened to us. Grange pulled out a manila folder from a drawer and spread several documents across the table. Garrett recognised them as copies of naval personnel records, technical specifications, and what appeared to be pages from a scientific journal. I spent years collecting these, Grange explained. Evidence that Project Ghostwake actually existed. Equipment requisitions, personnel assignments, even some of Dr. Reno's preliminary calculations. The Navy thought they'd destroyed everything, but bureaucracy is a wonderful thing. There are always copies somewhere. Garrett examined the documents, his trained eye noting the authentic-looking letterheads and official seals. If these were forgeries, they were exceptional ones. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Why break 40 years of silence?" Grange looked at him with those haunted eyes the waitress had described. "Because I'm dying, Mr. Niles, and because I've finally figured out what really happened to us out there in 1943. The truth is so much stranger than anything I initially understood." He stood and walked to the window again, his silhouette framed against the dark lake. "We didn't just travel through space that day, we travelled through time, and some of us never made it back to the right timeline." The fire had burned down to glowing embers by the time Ellis Grange began describing the details of what had happened aboard the USS Eldridge. Garrett had filled 2 hours of tape, but he sensed that the most important revelations were still to come. "You have to understand the technology they were working with," Grange continued, adding another log to the fire. "The Tesla coils weren't just generating electromagnetic fields. They were creating what Dr. Reno called phase lock barriers, distortions in the fabric of space-time itself. But that's impossible according to conventional physics. Conventional physics didn't account for Einstein's unified field theory. The Navy had access to research that wouldn't be published for decades, if ever. They knew that matter and energy were just different expressions of the same underlying reality, and that by manipulating electromagnetic fields in specific patterns, they could alter the fundamental properties of physical objects. Grange returned to his chair and opened a leather-bound notebook filled with technical diagrams and calculations. "I copied these from Dr. Reno's work log before they confiscated it. Look at this equation here." He pointed to a complex mathematical formula. "This describes the relationship between field strength and temporal displacement. Reno had calculated that exceeding 2.3 megawatts of synchronized power would create what he called chronological instability. Meaning that anything caught in the field wouldn't just become invisible, it would become unstuck from its proper place in time." Garrett studied the equation, though most of it was beyond his understanding. How much power were they actually using? "According to the readings I took before everything went wrong, we reached 4.7 megawatts, more than double the safe threshold. And no one noticed." "Oh, Reno noticed. He was screaming into his radio for them to shut down the generators. But the Navy observers were so excited by the visual effects that they ignored him. They wanted to see how long they could maintain the invisibility field." Grange turned the page to reveal a detailed schematic of the ship's electrical system. The problem was in the synchronization. The field generators were supposed to operate in perfect harmony, creating a stable envelope around the ship. But at higher power levels, tiny variations in timing created interference patterns. The field began to oscillate, creating pockets of temporal distortion throughout the hull. "That's what caused the crew members to be affected differently?" "Exactly. Johnson, the radio operator, was caught in a zone where time was moving very slowly. From his perspective, the metal was flowing like liquid, gradually surrounding him. But to the rest of us, it happened in seconds. Martinez was in an area where time was accelerated. He experienced months of aging in minutes. Thompson was caught between two opposing fields, existing in a state of temporal flux." "And Williams?" The one who remembered future events? Williams was the most interesting case. He was positioned near the ship's chronometer when the fields destabilized. I think he somehow became connected to the timeline itself, able to perceive past and future events as if they were happening simultaneously. Grange closed the notebook and looked directly at Garrett. But here's what the Navy never understood, what they couldn't have known from their limited perspective. The experiment didn't just displace the ship in space, it created a fracture in the timeline, a branch point where reality split into multiple possibilities. Multiple possibilities? Think of it like a river dividing around a rock. The water continues flowing, but now there are two separate streams. That's what happened to us. The timeline split and different versions of events began playing out simultaneously. Garrett felt a growing sense of vertigo, as if the solid ground beneath his feet was becoming unstable. Are you saying there are multiple versions of history? I'm saying there are multiple versions of October 28th, 1943. In one timeline, the experiment succeeded perfectly, and the USS Eldridge became the foundation for advanced naval technology. In another, the ship was destroyed and everyone aboard died. In yet another, the experiment never happened at all. And which timeline are we in now? That's the question I've been trying to answer for 38 years. Based on the evidence I've collected, I believe we're in a timeline where the experiment was partially successful, but officially covered up. The Navy managed to reverse some of the effects, but not all of them. Some of us were left behind, existing in the wrong version of reality. Grange stood and walked to a cabinet, withdrawing a small device that looked like a modified radio. I built this in 1967, based on principles I learned from Dr. Reno's work. It's a temporal resonance detector capable of identifying chronological anomalies. He switched on the device and it began emitting a low humming sound. Almost immediately the humming intensified and developed an irregular pattern. What's it detecting? You, Mr. Niles? You're not from this timeline either? Garrett felt his blood turn to ice. That's impossible. I was born in 1939. I have birth records, school transcripts, military service records. All of which could have been created as part of a cover story. Tell me, what's your earliest clear memory? Garrett thought back, trying to recall his childhood. I remember being in a hospital when I was very young, maybe 5 or 6 years old. There were doctors, and they were asking me questions about my family. And before that, nothing. I always assumed it was because I was too young to remember clearly. Grange nodded grimly. The Navy's psychiatric division developed techniques for implanting false memories in the 1950s. They used them on crew members who had experienced temporal displacement, creating new identities and backgrounds to help them integrate into normal society. You're saying they erased my real memories and gave me fake ones? I'm saying that you were one of the children rescued from the USS Eldridge after the experiment. The Navy couldn't explain how a child had appeared on a military vessel, so they created a new identity for you and placed you with adoptive parents. Garrett's mind reeled. Everything he thought he knew about himself, his history, his identity, was potentially a lie. But why would they send me the photograph? Why would they want me to find you? They didn't send it. I sent it to myself. What? Granger's expression became even more grim. This is the part that's going to be hardest to believe. The temporal displacement didn't just affect us in 1943, it created ongoing instability in the timeline. Sometimes information bleeds through from one version of reality to another. Sometimes people who died in one timeline find ways to communicate with those who survived in another. Are you saying you're dead? I'm saying that the Ellis Grange who sent you that photograph died in 1963. I'm a different Ellis Grange, one who survived because the timeline shifted around me. But I retained some of his memories, including his knowledge of your true identity. Garrett stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. This is insane. You're telling me that I'm not who I think I am, that you're not who you think you are, and that reality itself is unstable? I'm telling you the truth, even though it sounds impossible. The Philadelphia experiment didn't just bend space and time, it broke them. And we're all living in the aftermath, trying to make sense of a world that no longer follows the rules we thought we understood. Grange walked to another cabinet and withdrew a small metal box. There's something else you need to see, something that will prove what I'm telling you." He opened the box to reveal a collection of photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a child's drawing. He handed the drawing to Garrett, who recognised it immediately as the kind of crude artwork a young child might create with crayons. The drawing showed a ship surrounded by green fire with stick figures scattered across the deck. In the corner, in a child's uncertain handwriting, were the words, "My name is Garrett and I want to go home." "Where did you get this?" "It was in your pocket when they found you in the ship's galley after the experiment. You were approximately 5 years old, wearing a sailor's uniform that had been somehow altered to fit your small frame. You kept asking for someone named Sarah, but there was no record of any Sarah aboard the ship." Garrett stared at the drawing and fragments of memory began to surface. A woman's voice singing lullabies, the smell of apple pie, the feeling of being held and comforted. But these memories felt different from his constructed childhood, more real somehow, more vivid. "Sarah was my mother," he whispered, "my real mother." "I believe so. I think you were somehow pulled from your own timeline into ours during the experiment. The Navy couldn't explain your presence, so they created a new identity for you and tried to erase your memories of what had happened. But why would a child be on a military vessel? That's what we need to find out, because I don't think your presence was accidental. I think it was connected to the experiment in ways that even Dr. Reno didn't understand." Grange returned to his chair and pulled out a tape recorder of his own. "There's one more thing you need to hear. I made this recording in 1953, shortly after I was discharged from the Navy. I was afraid I might start forgetting details, so I documented everything I could remember." He pressed play, and after a moment of static, a younger version of his voice filled the room. "October 30th, 1953. This is electrician's mate Ellis Grange, formerly of the USS Eldridge. I am making this recording as a permanent record of the events that took place during Project Ghostwake. If something happens to me, if they decide I know too much, I want someone to know the truth." The recorded voice continued. The child appeared during the height of the temporal displacement. One moment the galley was empty, the next moment he was there, crying and calling for his mother. But here's the strange part. He seemed to know things about the ship that he shouldn't have known. He knew where the electrical stations were located. He knew the names of some of the crew members, and he kept talking about the green fire before any of us had mentioned it. Garrett felt a chill run down his spine. "I knew about the experiment before it happened." "That's what it sounds like, which suggests that your displacement wasn't just spatial, but temporal as well. You came from a timeline where the experiment had already occurred." The recorded voice grew more urgent. "Doctor." Reno examined the boy before they took him away. He said the child showed signs of temporal displacement syndrome, the same symptoms we saw in the crew members who were affected. But there was something else. Reno said the boy's cellular structure showed evidence of what he called quantum entanglement with the ship itself. What does that mean? It means you were somehow connected to the USS Eldridge at a fundamental level. Your presence during the experiment wasn't an accident. You were part of it. The recording continued. "Phase integrity cannot be held beyond 23 minutes. The field generators will overload, and the temporal displacement will become permanent. They are watching from the other side, waiting for us to make the same mistake again. Whatever happens, do not look into the green light. Do not let them complete the second experiment." The tape ended with a sharp click, leaving the room in silence. "Second experiment?" Garrett asked. "Something the Navy planned for 1947. They wanted to try to reverse the effects of the first experiment, to somehow repair the damage to the timeline. But according to my sources, the second experiment was never carried out, or at least it was never completed. What happened? That's what we need to find out, because I think the second experiment is the key to understanding who you really are and why you were brought here." The next morning, Garrett woke to find Ellis Grange already dressed and preparing breakfast. The older man moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to military routine, but there was an urgency in his movements that hadn't been there the night before. "We need to move quickly," Grange explained, pouring coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "There are others who know about the experiment, people who've been watching and waiting for someone like you to surface. Others? Dr. Jean Volner, for one. She worked at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study from 1941 to 1945, directly with Einstein and his team. She was one of the few people who understood the theoretical implications of what the Navy was trying to do. Garrett accepted the coffee gratefully, still trying to process everything he'd learned the night before. Is she still alive? As far as I know. She's been living in Princeton, conducting private research. But she's been careful to stay below the radar. The government has been monitoring anyone connected to the original project. Why would she talk to us? Because she's been waiting for you specifically. She knows who you are, Garrett. She knows what you represent. They finished breakfast in silence, then packed the car with Granger's collection of documents and photographs. As they drove south toward Princeton, Granger explained more about the network of researchers and former military personnel who had been quietly investigating the Philadelphia experiment for decades. The Navy thought they could bury the truth by separating everyone involved, he said. But they underestimated the determination of people who had seen reality itself bend and break. We found each other. Slowly. Carefully. We shared information, compared notes, tried to piece together the whole picture. How many of you are there? Not many. Most of the original crew members died young, often under mysterious circumstances. But those of us who survived have been keeping track of each other, watching for signs that the timeline instability is continuing. They reached Princeton by mid-afternoon, driving through the tree-lined streets of the university town until they reached a modest house near the campus. Dr. Jean Volner answered the door before they could knock, as if she'd been watching for their arrival. She was a small woman in her 70s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a simple dress and cardigan, but there was something about her bearing that suggested great dignity and inner strength. "Mr. Grange," she said, greeting them, "and you must be Garrett Niles. I've been expecting you for a very long time." She led them into a living room that doubled as a library, with books and scientific journals stacked on every available surface. The walls were covered with blackboards filled with complex equations and diagrams. "Dr. Volner," Garrett began, "Ellis tells me you worked on the theoretical foundations for the Philadelphia experiment." "I worked on what became the Philadelphia experiment," she corrected. "The Navy took Einstein's unified field theory and corrupted it, turned it into a weapon instead of a tool for understanding. We tried to warn them, but they wouldn't listen." She gestured for them to sit, then settled into a chair across from them. What they didn't understand was that the electromagnetic fields they were generating would create resonance patterns with the fundamental structure of space-time itself. They thought they were just bending light waves, but they were actually creating fissures in the fabric of reality. "Fissures that are still there," Grange added. "Oh yes, the damage was permanent. The timeline has been unstable ever since, with different versions of reality bleeding into each other. Most people don't notice because the changes are subtle, but those of us who know what to look for can see the signs." She stood and walked to one of the blackboards, pointing to a diagram that showed intersecting lines and mathematical symbols. "This represents the temporal structure around the October 28, 1943 event. As you can see, it's not a single timeline, but a web of interconnected possibilities." Garrett studied the diagram, trying to understand its implications. "Ellis thinks I'm from one of these alternate timelines." "You're not from an alternate timeline," Dr. Volner said gently. "You're from the original timeline, the one that existed before the experiment created the fracture. You're what we call a temporal anchor, someone whose presence helps stabilize the chronological structure." "But I'm just a writer. I don't have any special abilities." "Your ability is to remember, Mr. Niles. Even with your modified memories, you retain a connection to the original timeline. That's why you've been drawn to investigate suppressed military projects, why you've been able to uncover things that others couldn't find." She returned to her chair and looked at him with those penetrating eyes. "The Navy didn't just find you on the USS Eldridge. They brought you there deliberately, as part of the experiment. They needed someone with temporal stability to anchor the ship during the displacement. But I was just a child. Children are naturally more flexible when it comes to temporal displacement. Adults have fixed neural patterns that resist chronological change. But a child's mind is still developing, still adaptable." Grange leaned forward. "Are you saying they kidnapped him?" "I'm saying they removed him from his original timeline as part of the experimental protocol. It was supposed to be temporary, but when the experiment went wrong, he became stranded in our version of reality. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Garrett felt a mixture of anger and grief, mourning for a life and a family he could barely remember. "There's more, Doctor," Volner continued. "The Navy has been planning a second experiment, one designed to repair the timeline damage. They've been waiting for the right conditions, the right personnel. They need someone with temporal stability to anchor the process. They need me," Garrett realised. "They need you. But what they don't realise is that attempting to repair the timeline could make things much worse. The fracture has been stable for 38 years. Trying to heal it now could cause the entire temporal structure to collapse." What would that mean? It would mean the end of this version of reality. Everything that has happened since 1943 would be undone, replaced by whatever timeline emerges from the collapse. Grange stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. When is this second experiment supposed to happen? Soon. My sources suggest they're planning to conduct it within the next few weeks. They've been preparing for years, assembling the equipment, recruiting the personnel. Where? The same place as the original experiment, the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. They believe that conducting the second experiment in the same location will help stabilize the process. Garrett felt a growing sense of urgency. "We have to stop them." "Do we?" Dr. Volner asked quietly. "Or do we help them complete what they started?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Dr. Volner stood and walked to a filing cabinet, withdrawing a thick folder marked with symbols that Garrett didn't recognize. "There's something else you need to understand about your situation," she said, opening the folder to reveal dozens of photographs. "You're not the only temporal anchor. The Navy has been collecting people like you for decades." The photographs showed men and women of various ages, all with a similar look in their eyes, the same haunted expression that Garrett had seen in his own mirror. Each photo was labelled with a date and location, spanning from 1943 to the present. "These are all people who were displaced by the original experiment," Grange asked. "Or by subsequent experiments. The Navy didn't stop with the USS Eldridge. They've been conducting smaller-scale tests ever since, trying to understand and control the temporal effects. Each experiment creates new displacements, new anchors scattered across different timelines." Garrett picked up one of the photographs showing a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20. "What happens to them?" "Most live normal lives, never knowing their true origin, but some, like you, begin to remember. They're drawn to investigate the very phenomena that created them. It's a kind of temporal homing instinct." Dr. Volner sat back down and fixed Garrett with an intense stare. "The Navy has been monitoring you for years, Mr. Niles. Every book you've written, every investigation you've conducted, has been leading to this moment. They've been waiting for you to discover your true nature, so they can use me in their second experiment. Yes, but here's what they don't know, what they can't know because they're thinking linearly about time. The second experiment has already happened." Ellis Grange nearly dropped his coffee cup. "What do you mean?" "In 1947, the Navy did attempt to repair the timeline. The experiment was conducted in secret, using technology derived from the original Philadelphia experiment. It was supposed to undo the damage to restore a single, stable timeline. And it failed? It succeeded, but not in the way they expected." Dr. Volner stood and began pacing the room. The 1947 experiment did repair the timeline, but it created a paradox. If the original damage was undone, then the repair experiment never would have been necessary. So the timeline split again, creating a version of reality where the repair was needed and another where it wasn't. Garrett felt his head spinning. "So we're living in the timeline where the repair failed?" "We're living in a timeline where the repair both succeeded and failed simultaneously. It's what we call a quantum superposition of historical states. Multiple versions of the past exist at the same time, overlapping and interfering with each other." She returned to the blackboard and began drawing a new diagram. "This is why you've been experiencing memory flashes, why you've been drawn to investigate these phenomena. You exist in multiple timelines simultaneously, and occasionally information bleeds through from one to another." "But Ellis said I was from the original timeline before the experiment." "You are, but you're also from the timeline where the experiment succeeded, and the timeline where it failed catastrophically. You're a convergence point, a place where all the possibilities meet. Grange set down his cup and rubbed his temples. This is giving me a headache. It should. Your brain isn't designed to process non-linear temporal information, but Garrett's is because he was modified by the displacement process. He can perceive and remember events from multiple timelines. Dr. Volner turned back to Garrett. That's why the Navy needs you for their new experiment. They want to use your ability to navigate the temporal superposition, to choose which version of reality becomes dominant. And if I refuse, then the instability continues, and eventually the overlapping timelines will collapse into each other. Reality will become increasingly chaotic until it reaches a point where human civilization can no longer function. And if I cooperate, then you'll have the power to choose which version of history becomes real. You could restore the original timeline, the one where you belonged with your real family. Or you could maintain the current reality, where billions of people have lived their entire lives. Or you could choose something entirely different. The weight of the decision pressed down on Garrett like a physical force. How much time do I have? Not much. My sources indicate that the Navy is preparing to move within the next few days. They've been tracking your investigation, and they know you're close to discovering the truth. As if summoned by her words, the sound of cars pulling up outside reached their ears. Dr. Volner moved quickly to the window and peered through the curtains. They're here, she said grimly. 3 black sedans, government plates. Grange was already moving toward the back door. Is there another way out? Through the basement, but they'll have the house surrounded. Dr. Volner grabbed a small leather satchel from her desk. Garrett, you need to take this. It contains everything you'll need to understand the choice you have to make. What choice? Whether to complete the circle or break it, whether to become the anchor that stabilizes reality, or the force that sets it free. The sound of footsteps on the front porch interrupted their conversation. Someone was knocking politely but insistently on the front door. Dr. Volner, this is Agent Morrison with the Department of Naval Intelligence. We need to speak with you. She handed Garrett the satchel and pushed them toward the basement stairs. There's a tunnel that connects to the university steam system. Follow it north until you reach the physics building. From there, you can access the archives. What archives? The ones that contain the real records of the Philadelphia experiment. Everything the Navy thought they destroyed. As they descended into the basement, they could hear the front door being opened and voices filling the house above. Dr. Volner's voice carried down the stairs as she greeted the agents with polite formality. The basement was cramped and filled with decades' worth of accumulated belongings, but Grange quickly located the entrance to the tunnel system. It was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, and it disappeared into darkness. After you, Grange whispered. As they crawled through the narrow tunnel, Garrett could hear the muffled sounds of the house being searched above them. They emerged 20 minutes later in the basement of the university physics building, dirty and exhausted but undetected. Now what? Garrett asked, brushing dust from his clothes. Now we find out what really happened in 1947, Grange replied, and we figure out how to stop it from happening again. The Princeton University Physics Building after hours was a maze of darkened corridors and locked laboratories. Grange seemed to know exactly where he was going, leading Garrett through a series of basement passages to a section that appeared to have been abandoned for years. Dr. Volner told me about this place, he explained, producing a set of keys from his pocket. It's where they stored the classified research from the 1940s, the projects that were too sensitive to keep in the main archives. They reached a heavy steel door marked Authorized Personnel Only. Granger's key turned easily in the lock, suggesting that someone had been maintaining access to this forgotten vault. Inside, rows of filing cabinets stretched into the darkness, filled with the accumulated secrets of decades of government research. Grange moved directly to a section marked 1943 to 1947, Project Ghost Wake, as if he'd been here before. How did you know exactly where to look? Garrett asked. Because I've been here before in another timeline. Sometimes the memories bleed through. He pulled out a thick file and spread its contents across a nearby table. Among the documents were photographs of the USS Eldridge, technical specifications for the field generators, and what appeared to be personal journals written by members of the research team. "Look at this," Grange said, pointing to a series of photographs dated October 29th, 1943. These were taken the day after the experiment. The photographs showed the interior of the ship, and Garrett could see the evidence of what Grange had described. Scorch marks along the bulkheads, metal surfaces that appeared to have been melted and reformed, and in one disturbing image, what looked like human remains fused into the ship's structure. "My God," Garrett whispered, "it really happened." "It really happened. But look at this." Grange pulled out another set of photographs, these dated November the 15th, 1943. They showed the same areas of the ship, but now they appeared completely normal. No scorch marks, no melted metal, no sign that anything unusual had occurred. They repaired the damage? Or they replaced the ship entirely? There are records here suggesting that the Navy constructed an identical vessel to substitute for the original Eldridge. Garrett continued examining the documents, finding more evidence of the cover-up. Personnel records showed that crew members from the experiment had been scattered to different assignments, often with notation that they had suffered combat fatigue or psychological trauma. But it was the final document in the file that made his blood run cold. It was a memorandum dated December 1st, 1943, signed by someone identified only as Director Special Projects Division. The memo read, "Subject, Temporal Anchor Recovery. The child designated Subject 7 has been successfully integrated into civilian population. Memory modification procedures complete. Subject shows no retention of displacement experience. Recommend continued monitoring through standard protocols." "Subject 7, Garrett said quietly. "That was me." "It was you. But look at the date on that memo. December 1st, 1943. The experiment was October 28th. They held you for over a month before placing you with your adoptive family. What were they doing to me during that time?" Grange pulled out another folder, this one containing medical records and psychological evaluations. "They were studying you, trying to understand how the temporal displacement had affected your physiology and psychology, and they were preparing you. For what? For this moment. For the choice you're going to have to make." As they continued searching through the archives, they found evidence of ongoing research throughout the 1940s and 1950s. The Navy had never abandoned the Philadelphia experiment. They had simply moved it underground, conducting smaller tests and refining their understanding of temporal manipulation. In a file marked Project Kronos-1947, they found detailed plans for what the Navy had called the Restoration Protocol. The goal was to use controlled temporal fields to heal the fracture created by the original experiment. "But according to Dr. Volner, this experiment already happened," Garrett said. "It did, and here's the proof." Grange handed him a mission report dated March 15th, 1947. The experiment was conducted using a modified destroyer, the USS Phoenix, at the same Philadelphia shipyard. They achieved temporal stabilization for exactly 47 minutes before the field generators overloaded. What happened then? Read for yourself. The report was clinical in its language, but the implications were terrifying. The temporal stabilization had indeed repaired the original fracture, but it had created a new type of instability. Instead of a single split in the timeline, there were now multiple fractures radiating outward from the 1943 event. It made things worse, Garrett realized. Much worse, and they've been trying to fix it ever since. At the bottom of the file, they found something that made their search suddenly urgent. It was a tape recording labelled simply "Final Message Doctor." Franklin Reno, March 15th, 1947. Grange found an old tape player among the archive equipment and inserted the reel. After a moment of static, a voice filled the room. Tired, frightened, but determined to leave a record of what had happened. "This is Dr. Franklin Reno, recording what I believe will be my final message. The restoration protocol has failed catastrophically. Instead of healing the temporal fracture, we have created what I can only describe as a cascade failure in the chronological structure of reality." The voice paused, and they could hear explosions and shouting in the background. "The field generators are overloading beyond our ability to control them. The USS Phoenix is experiencing the same displacement effects as the Eldridge, but magnified 100-fold. We are seeing spontaneous temporal rifts opening throughout the shipyard. Another pause, then the voice became more urgent. To whoever finds this recording, do not attempt another restoration. The timeline cannot be repaired through technological means. The only solution is to find the original temporal anchor, the child who was present during the first experiment. He is the key to stabilizing the chronological structure, but not in the way the Navy believes. Static filled the tape for several seconds before Reno's voice returned, now barely above a whisper. The child was not displaced from another timeline. He was displaced from the future, from a point approximately 38 years after the original experiment. He is not the solution to the temporal instability. He is the cause of it. Garrett felt the world tilt around him. I'm the cause? The temporal loop is completing itself. The child's presence in 1943 creates the conditions that lead to his own displacement. It's a causal paradox that cannot be resolved through conventional means. The tape continued with increasing urgency. The only way to break the loop is for the child, when he reaches the appropriate age, to return to the point of origin and choose to break the cycle. But doing so will erase his existence from all timelines. He will never have been born, never have lived, never have loved. The recording ended with the sound of metal tearing and a final scream that was cut off abruptly. In the silence that followed, Garrett and Grange stared at each other across the table, covered with evidence of decades of government conspiracy and scientific hubris. So that's my choice, Garrett said finally. Save reality by erasing myself from existence. Or preserve yourself and let the timeline continue to deteriorate until everything collapses. When? Soon. The instability has been building for 38 years. Dr. Volner estimates that the cascade failure will reach critical mass within days. Garrett stood and walked to the small window that provided the archive's only natural light. Outside he could see the first light of dawn breaking over the Princeton campus, and for a moment everything seemed perfectly normal. Students would wake up and go to classes, professors would conduct research, life would continue as it always had. But underneath that normalcy, he now knew reality itself was fracturing. The timeline was collapsing, and he was the only one who could stop it. The only question was whether he had the courage to pay the price. The decision to break into the Naval Academy archives was made for them when they returned to Granger's car to find it surrounded by federal agents. They watched from the physics building as their vehicle was searched and several men in dark suits took positions around the parking lot. "They're not going to let us leave," Garrett observed. "Then we don't leave. We finish what we came here to do." Grange led him back into the university's tunnel system, this time heading south toward the railway station. There's a freight train that runs to Baltimore every morning at 6 a.m. From there, we can catch a bus to Annapolis. How do you know all this? Because I've done this before, in another timeline. Sometimes the memories are so clear it's like I'm living the same events over and over again. They emerged from the tunnels near the train yard just as the freight train was beginning to move. It was an old-fashioned operation, with boxcars that could be opened from the outside. They managed to slip into an empty car just as the train picked up speed. The journey to Baltimore took 3 hours, during which Grange shared more of what he'd learned during his decades of investigation. The government's interest in the Philadelphia experiment had never waned. If anything, it had intensified as they began to understand the long-term implications of temporal instability. They've been preparing for this moment since 1947, he explained. Building new equipment, training personnel, developing protocols for what they call chronological restoration. But they don't understand what they're really dealing with. Which is the fundamental nature of time itself. They think it's something that can be manipulated like matter or energy, but time is more like consciousness. It has its own logic, its own intentions. From Baltimore, they took a series of buses to Annapolis, using cash and staying alert for any signs of pursuit. By afternoon, they had reached the Naval Academy, where Grange seemed to know exactly which building housed the classified archives. The coordinates were in Dr. Reno's final notes, he explained. Building 147, sub-basement level 3. That's where they moved the most sensitive Philadelphia experiment materials after the 1947 incident. Getting into the building required skills that Grange had apparently learned during his years of investigation. He produced lockpicks from his coat pocket and worked with the efficiency of a professional burglar. "Military training," he said in response to Garrett's questioning look. "They taught us all kinds of useful skills during the war." The Naval Academy after hours was eerily quiet, with only security guards making their rounds at predictable intervals. Grange led them through a maze of corridors to a service elevator that descended far below the main building. The sub-basement was a different world entirely, filled with the kind of heavy-duty storage systems used for highly classified materials. Rows of vault doors stretched into the distance, each marked with cryptic alphanumeric codes. E13, Grange muttered, searching for the specific vault. Displacement casualties. They found the vault at the end of a long corridor, its steel door secured with multiple locks and electronic sensors. But when Grange tried the handle, it opened easily. "Someone's been here recently," he said, noting the lack of dust on the doorframe. Inside, the vault was filled with filing cabinets and storage boxes, all meticulously organised and labelled. It was clear that this archive had been actively maintained, with new materials added regularly over the decades. Garrett went directly to a filing cabinet marked Temporal Anchors, Active Cases, and began searching through the files. What he found made his blood run cold. There were dozens of files, each representing a person who'd been displaced by various temporal experiments. Names, photographs, current addresses, and detailed psychological profiles. The government had been tracking people like him for decades, monitoring their lives and waiting for the right moment to activate them. But it was his own file that stopped him cold. It was thick with documentation spanning nearly 40 years, from the initial displacement report in 1943 to recent surveillance photographs taken outside his Brooklyn apartment. The file contained everything: his real birth certificate from 1938, records of his time aboard the USS Eldridge, documentation of the memory modification procedures, and detailed plans for his eventual activation as a temporal anchor. Most disturbing of all was a psychological profile written just weeks earlier, predicting with frightening accuracy the exact sequence of events that had led him to this moment. "They've been orchestrating everything," he said, showing the file to Grange. "My meeting you, finding Dr. Volner, discovering my true identity. It's all been planned." "Of course it has. They need you to willingly participate in the final experiment. Temporal anchoring only works if the subject makes a conscious choice to stabilise the timeline. And if I refuse? Then the cascade failure continues, and reality eventually collapses into chaos." Garrett continued searching through the files until he found what appeared to be the master plan for the operation they called temporal restoration. The documents were recent, some dated just days earlier, and they outlined a scenario that was both elegant and terrifying. The government planned to recreate the exact conditions of the original Philadelphia experiment, but this time using Garrett as a willing participant. His temporal anchor abilities would allow him to navigate the chronological instabilities and guide the timeline back to a stable configuration. But the cost would be enormous. According to the technical specifications, the process would require Garrett to exist simultaneously in all the fractured timelines, experiencing every possible version of history before choosing which one would become real. It would destroy my mind, he realised. No human consciousness could survive experiencing multiple complete lifetimes simultaneously. Which is why they've been preparing you since childhood. The memory modifications, the psychological conditioning, even your career as an investigative writer. It's all been designed to strengthen your mental resilience for this moment. At the bottom of the file, they found a final document that changed everything. It was a letter, handwritten on personal stationery, dated just 3 days earlier. "My dear Garrett," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have discovered the truth about your origin and your purpose. I know this must be overwhelming, but I want you to know that you have a choice. The government believes they can force you to participate in their experiment, but they are wrong. There is another way." The letter was signed Sarah and included an address in Philadelphia. "My mother," Garrett whispered. "She's still alive." "In which timeline?" Grange asked quietly. There's only one way to find out. The address led them to a small row house in a working-class neighbourhood of Philadelphia, just a few miles from the naval shipyard where everything had begun. The house was neat and well-maintained, with a small garden and lace curtains in the windows. Garrett stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, gathering the courage to knock on the door. 38 years of modified memories warred with fragmented recollections of a woman's voice singing lullabies and the smell of apple pie cooling on a kitchen windowsill. When the door finally opened, he found himself face to face with a woman in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that widened in recognition when she saw him. "Garrett," she said simply, "I knew you'd come home eventually." Sarah McBride, for that was her real name, led them into a living room that felt instantly familiar, though Garrett couldn't identify any specific memories associated with it. She moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for a very long time. "I've been waiting for you," she said, settling into a chair across from them. "Ever since they took you away in 1943, I've been waiting for the day when you'd remember who you really are." "How is this possible?" Garrett asked. "If I was displaced from 1943, how could you have been my mother? I would have been born in 1938. "You were born in 1938, but not in this timeline." Sarah stood and walked to a mantelpiece lined with photographs. "In the original timeline, the one that existed before the Philadelphia experiment, you lived a normal childhood. We lived together in this house until you were 5 years old." She handed him a photograph showing a young woman holding a small boy. The child's face was unmistakably Garrett's, and the woman was clearly a younger version of Sarah. "The temporal displacement didn't just move you through space," she continued. "It moved you backward through time, from 1943 to 1943. But in the process, it created a causal loop that has been growing more unstable for 38 years. I don't understand." "The child who was displaced in 1943 was you at age 5, but you weren't displaced from another location. You were displaced from the future, from 1981, to be exact." Grange leaned forward. "That's impossible. How could a child from 1981 appear in 1943? "Because time isn't linear, Mr. Grange. It's circular. The Philadelphia experiment created a closed temporal loop, with Garrett existing at both the beginning and the end. He was displaced as a child in 1943, grew up with modified memories, and then discovered his true identity in 1981. The loop is about to complete itself." Sarah returned to her chair and looked directly at Garrett. "The government believes they need you to stabilize the timeline, but they're wrong. The timeline doesn't need to be stabilized. It needs to be allowed to complete its natural cycle. Which means you need to return to 1943 and allow yourself to be displaced. But this time, instead of fighting the displacement, you need to embrace it. Allow the temporal loop to close naturally. And what happens to me? You return to your childhood, to your real childhood. The memories of these 38 years fade away like a dream, and you grow up as you were meant to, with me as your mother." The implications hit Garrett like a physical blow. But everyone I've known, everything I've accomplished as an adult, it all disappears. "From your perspective, yes. But from the perspective of the timeline, it was never real to begin with. You've been living in a temporal echo, a reflection of a life that couldn't exist once the loop was closed." Grange stood and walked to the window looking out at the street. "When does this have to happen?" "Tonight. The government is planning their final experiment for midnight at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. If Garrett participates in their restoration protocol, the temporal instabilities will be locked in place permanently. But if he returns to the displacement point willingly, the loop can close naturally." "How do we get into the shipyard?" "We don't. They'll bring Garrett there." Sarah reached into a drawer and pulled out a cell phone. "I'm going to call them and tell them we're ready to cooperate." "That's insane," Garrett protested. "They'll just force me to participate in their experiment." "No, they won't, because they need your willing participation, and they know I'm the only person who can convince you to cooperate. They'll listen to my terms." She dialed a number and waited. After a moment, she spoke into the phone with the authority of someone who was accustomed to being taken seriously. "This is Sarah McBride. I'm calling about my son. Yes, I know what you're planning for tonight. He'll cooperate, but only under my conditions. The displacement chamber from the original experiment. I want it set up exactly as it was in 1943, because that's the only way this works, and you know it. She hung up and turned back to them. They'll agree. They have no choice. The timeline instability has reached critical mass. If they don't resolve it tonight, the cascade failure will destroy everything. As if to underscore her words, the lights in the house flickered, and for a moment Garrett could swear he saw a different version of the room, one where the furniture was arranged differently, and the walls were painted a different colour. It's starting, Sarah said quietly. The timelines are beginning to merge. We have maybe 6 hours before reality becomes completely unstable. They spent the remaining daylight hours at Sarah's house, and she told Garrett stories about his real childhood. The birthday parties, the bedtime stories, the summer afternoons spent playing in the small garden behind the house. With each story, more memories began to surface, not the artificial recollections that had been implanted, but real memories of love and security and belonging. As evening approached, a government car arrived to take them to the shipyard. The agents were polite but tense, clearly aware that they were dealing with forces beyond their complete understanding. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard at night was a maze of shadows and security lights. They were escorted to a warehouse that had been converted into a laboratory, filled with equipment that looked both familiar and alien. At the centre of the space was a metal chamber that Garrett recognised from his childhood nightmares. The displacement chamber from the USS Eldridge. Dr. Jean Volner was there, along with a team of government scientists and military personnel. But there was something different about her appearance, as if she was flickering between different versions of herself. The timeline deterioration is accelerating, she explained. We're seeing spontaneous manifestations of alternate realities throughout the facility. If we don't stabilise the temporal structure within the next hour, the entire eastern seaboard could be affected. Then let's get this over with, Garrett said. He approached the displacement chamber, but Sarah caught his arm. Remember, she said quietly, don't fight it. Let the displacement take you where you need to go. Trust that you'll find your way home. Will I remember any of this? For a while. But as you grow up again, the memories will fade, and that's as it should be. Children shouldn't have to carry the weight of adult sorrows. Garrett stepped into the chamber, and immediately felt the same sensation he had experienced in his dreams. The feeling of being underwater while still being able to breathe. The green fire began to dance along the metal walls, and he could hear the familiar humming of field generators spinning up to power. Through the chamber's window, he could see the laboratory around him beginning to change. The modern equipment flickered and was replaced by 1940s-era technology. The people watching shifted and transformed, becoming younger versions of themselves or different people entirely. He saw Ellis Grange as a young man standing at an electrical station and monitoring field strength readings. He saw Dr. Reno frantically trying to shut down the experiment. And he saw himself as a 5-year-old child, appearing in the ship's galley, exactly as Grange had described. The temporal loop was closing. The displacement that had begun 38 years ago was finally completing itself. As the green fire intensified, Garrett felt his adult consciousness beginning to fade. The memories of his investigation, his career as a writer, his long search for the truth, all began to recede like dreams upon waking. But in their place came other memories, real memories of a childhood filled with love and laughter, of a mother who sang him to sleep and baked cookies on rainy afternoons. He remembered birthday parties and Christmas mornings and summer days that seemed to last forever. The last thing he saw before the displacement completed was Sarah's face, young again, smiling at him through the chamber window, and the last thing he heard was her voice, calling him home. When the green fire finally faded, the chamber was empty. The temporal loop had closed, the timeline had stabilized, and Garrett Niles, the adult who had spent 38 years searching for the truth about his identity, simply ceased to exist. But in a small house in Philadelphia, in a timeline where the Philadelphia experiment had never created a temporal fracture, a 5-year-old boy named Garrett McBride woke from a strange dream about ships and green fire and men who weren't there. His mother was there to comfort him, to tell him that dreams couldn't hurt him, and to sing him back to sleep with a lullaby about coming home. Ellis Grange woke up the next morning in his Vermont cabin, with no memory of government conspiracies or temporal displacement. He had been a Navy electrician during the war, and nothing more. He lived a quiet life by the lake, fishing and reading and occasionally wondering why he sometimes dreamed about a ship that could disappear. Dr. Jean Volner continued her research at Princeton, working on theoretical physics problems that had nothing to do with time travel or government experiments. She published papers on electromagnetic field theory and lived a peaceful academic life, though she sometimes had the strangest feeling that she had once known something important that she had somehow forgotten. And in the files of the Naval Academy archives, there was no record of Project Ghostwake, no documentation of temporal experiments, no evidence that reality had ever been anything other than what it appeared to be. The only trace of what had happened was a small child's drawing, tucked away in a box of old papers in Sarah McBride's attic. It showed a ship surrounded by green fire, with stick figures scattered across the deck, and in the corner, in a child's uncertain handwriting, were the words, "My name is Garrett, and I want to go home." But even that drawing would eventually be forgotten, packed away with other childhood mementos that seemed important at the time, but lost their meaning as the years passed. The timeline had healed itself not through technology or government intervention, but through the simple act of a son returning to his mother's love. And in the end, that was the only truth that mattered. Some mysteries, the story seemed to suggest, were not meant to be solved but lived through. And some journeys home required travelling through impossible distances of time and space, only to discover that the destination had been waiting all along. In the restored timeline, there were no men who weren't there, no ships that could disappear, no children displaced from their proper time. There was only the ordinary magic of daily life, mothers and children, love and memory, and the quiet certainty that home was not a place, but a feeling that time could not erase.